Good evening. My name is Jen Handy, and I am SHEP's Director of Grants and Engagement. Thank you for joining us tonight for this summer's second Practitioner Insights event. These events are designed for the SHEP community and specifically our interns to have the chance to hear from innovative and dynamic leaders doing anti-poverty work. We ask our guests to come on and kind of talk shop, if you will, for a while about the trends in their field, but we also want to hear more about their unique career path and kind of how they got where they are today. These events are also designed to be a little bit more informal than our other speaker series and kind of upcoming conference. So we will start off by hearing from our guests, but then you'll have the chance to ask your own questions about her work or her path or wherever it needs to go. For now, if you could keep your microphones off, you can put questions in the chat or save them up. Also, for you to know, some of our interns are working evening shifts for the community partners, and some will be attending community meetings. So we are recording the event tonight, and I will try and have it up as soon as I can. So tonight, we have the pleasure of hearing from Maisie Campbell. She is the program manager with More Than Food Consulting. In that role, she works with food banks and local agencies to improve their practices around nutrition and to encourage welcoming environments for all of their shoppers. Maisie graduated with a degree in mathematics and environmental studies from Bowdoin College and also studied multiple languages. Tonight, she will also talk a bit about her undergraduate experience and the impact on her career. Thank you for being with us, Maisie.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
Can you kick things off by telling us a little bit about the work happening at More Than Food and some of the projects you're working on now?
Absolutely. So yeah, my name is Maisie Campbell. Very excited to be with you all. I use she, her pronouns. And More Than Food Consulting launched almost a year ago. We're almost to our 1-year anniversary, which is really exciting. And our mission and vision is to advance organizational and systems change within the charitable food network to ensure people have economic and nutrition security. And we're called More Than Food Consulting because we're founded on the belief that it really does take more than food to end hunger. We have 3 main strategies in doing our work that we try to work into every project that we come across, that we touch, which are using translational research. So both conducting research and translating it into realistic tools for food bankers, food pantries, and other key stakeholders in the charitable food world. Capacity building, so things like offering trainings, speaking events, developing new tools and programs, and inspiring action. Because sometimes you just need to know things are possible. So our work is really national in scope. My boss and I'm going to use the imperial we a lot when describing our work because we are a small and mighty team and we do a lot of things in partnership with a lot of other great organizations. But we work very closely with organizations like Feeding America and food banks across the country, as well as with some of their partner agencies, so directly with food pantries and meal programs to really embrace these better practices in charitable food work to create long-term solutions to hunger and really address some of those underlying causes in poverty. Such as poverty. And that can look very different depending on who we're working with. Sometimes it's more research focused, sometimes it's more capacity building and focusing on what we consider the 3 C's. So in food pantry work specifically, we talk about offering choice, creating a welcoming culture, and building connection to other community resources. And I can dig into that more, but that's a broad overview.
Great. So when you're working with kind of the research side, I'm trying to kind of dig in. I would say a lot of people on this call probably didn't know that nonprofit consulting was a thing. I think we all know people who graduated and went to kind of do consulting work. And I don't know how many of those are doing like kind of nonprofit things, or I'd love to hear more about kind of what that is, how that works. And also, I know we have some people who are interested in research side of things. And so how you work with researchers, either like, are they more biology, economics, policy, that sort of thing? Kind of a big question.
Absolutely. So would it be helpful if I also backed up a little bit and talked about the charitable food system as a whole, or where are you all in the audience? Familiar or less familiar?
I would say, I'm guessing 50% are very familiar because they have done work with it, and some 50% are saying charitable what?
Great.
Is that about right? Okay. So I would go for it.
I'm gonna share my screen a little bit because I love pictures and I find it helpful when talking about this work. So when we're talking about the charitable food system, we're talking about this decades old system of distributing food to people in need. There is Feeding America, which is a national organization, kind of the umbrella organization for food banks and food pantries and in the United States. And they provide a lot of the oversight, organizational support, and capacity building directly to those food banks. Then Feeding America has about 200 partner food banks or member food banks. And those are, think of like a Costco warehouse full of food, and they're distributing it to, like, that's not how Costco works, but to a lot of smaller agencies who distribute directly to the people. And that's really the distinction between food banks and food pantries. You'll come across food pantries who are direct distribution agencies. So they are taking food and handing it out directly to people in need. And some food pantries will call themselves food banks. They will call themselves other things like community markets or food co-ops. But just when I'm talking about different levels of the charitable food system, that's often what I mean when I say food bank and food pantry. And when we talk about better practices in this charitable food system that is reliant on donations, on charity, on government programs and funding, it's important to understand how critical this is in the overall food system, because people who rely on food pantries for food often rely on food pantries on a chronic basis. They're not coming just once when their rent is late and they need support today. Given the ever-changing economics of our country, a lot of times you see the same people in line week after week, month after month, year after year. That is not always true, but that's often what we talk about. You'll hear people talk about ending the line or reducing the need. So it's really important context to think about how food pantries are part of that national and local food system. It's a major source of food for people in our country and also a major food distribution network. And when we think about how that's changed over the last 40 years, this picture on the left was taken by my boss 40 years ago in New York City. And you can see people lined up around the block waiting to receive a pre-packed bag of food and go on their way. And with COVID, what we saw was a reversion to a lot of those practices. And you'll see that this picture on the right was obviously much more recent. People are still lining up down the block, waiting to receive that food. So in a lot of ways, there have been many changes in the last 40 years. And also there have been a lot of things kept consistent and kept the same. And in our work, we talk a lot about how can we promote these better practices that are evidence-based. So when we talk about research, it's research directly within the community-based research on the effectiveness of programs and the impact of these programs. And what I love to think about is how can this look if it's not people lining up down the street in hot or cold in the humid Georgia weather or the frigid Vermont winters. What can this look like? And these are some of the better practices that we talk about a lot. So in terms of creating a welcoming environment, having people come in and select the foods that are going to best meet their own food needs and preferences, their family's food needs and preferences, and providing and promoting a variety of healthy foods, equipping people with the skills they need to prepare that food, and connecting to other community resources like nutrition education, budgeting, SNAP benefits, whatever it might be, but to support people in their journey. This is what it can look like. And when if you asked me like 5 years ago if I was going to be in consulting, I probably would have said, no, what does a consultant do? But for my organization, my firm, we really work to build that connection between organizations doing this work and doing it really well, and developing programs that are going to best support that work and promoting it. So my boss, Katie Martin, has been working in this field for 40 years. And she is a researcher by trade. So she's a PhD, has spent decades in academia doing community-based research with food pantries and food banks to test out practices, survey guests and neighbors about how these impact them, and use that to develop systems that are going to be better over a longer period of time. So that's the kind of research we're talking about, and the kind of consulting we do, because once you start this work, it's important to understand what the impacts are and to support others who are interested in doing this work, right? It's not a self-sustaining system. There's a lot of capacity building that goes in, a lot of training. And something we like to offer and do a lot of is what we facilitate peer learning opportunities. So kind of like this session today, where you're bringing a bunch of students with common interests together to learn from folks. We bring people offering the same programs in, are working to implement the healthy eating research, nutrition guidelines of their food bank. And while we're there as experts to support them, answer questions, it's also an opportunity to hear how other people are addressing similar challenges, share successes, and so much more. So that's another brief overview of what this work can look like.
One thing I wanted to point out that people may not have put together, a lot of times people assume that people using these services are also like, it's a requirement to be on food stamps or something like this, but actually these are actually targeting a lot of families, what I sometimes refer to as a bubble family. So like maybe you're above 130% of poverty, but under 200, so it's really sometimes people who are choosing between paying utilities and getting food. So it's not just, the charitable food network is not based solely on income guidelines. Some have some for some programs, and others do whatever they want, which is great. Like they can kind of have that flexibility there.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Jen. I'm going to piggyback off, because it's really important when you're working in this field to understand both what biases you might have going into it and to understand who you're serving, right? That's a question we hear from people all the time, is who's coming to our door and how do we know why they're here? Because if you don't know why folks are coming, then you don't know what other services might be most beneficial. So there's a whole category of people that are called like the ALICE population, asset limited, income constrained, employed, because I'm sure a lot of you know, you can work a full-time job in this country or multiple part-time jobs and still not make enough to cover your rent, cover your utilities, care for your children, cover your car, et cetera, et cetera. And with COVID, what we saw was a huge spotlight shone on this issue, because so many people were suddenly not one paycheck away from not being able to pay their rent. They were there. People are losing their jobs. People had just made investments that were no longer valid. And we saw like record high numbers and record high support for those people as they were seeking out charitable food through their food pantry, through emergency distributions, through schools. And unfortunately, from what I hear at pantries, those numbers are continuing to grow. Recently, a lot of the COVID era SNAP benefits have just ended. I'm probably telling you things you already know, but we're coming on that benefits cliff that is really challenging for food banks and food pantries to continue operating. A lot of the federal funding has ceased, and now we're continuing to understand how we're going to support people in this kind of post-COVID world.
And just to, I know I'm looking at all the names and I'm like trying to remember where everyone is. And so just, I know I see some people who are with public defenders. So thinking through legal costs where you're trying to figure out, I'm trying to regain custody or this sort of thing, but also I need food. And so the pinch in a crisis, or I see at least 4 or 5 of y'all who are in medical settings. So even on the sliding scale for medicine, getting the medicine you need to stay with a chronic disease and maintain that. Food, utilities, like we are treating these as like, hey, first we talked about health and now we're talking about food, but they're much more interwoven. And we have a lot of people here who want to go on and be physicians. And so understanding having that understanding of like, hey, just having them eat certain foods or get those pressures kind of go all around the student, and the patient.
And that's something we talk about with food pantries all the time. A lot of my work is thinking about how food pantries can be access points to other services. So you might come because you need food and be able to be connected to other resources like a public defender, or if you're visiting your doctor for a health-related problem and they actually go through the health screening for food insecurity, which exists, then they can refer you to charitable food. And we know these problems are so closely linked. That's one of the main focus areas of my work is nutrition related. So there's a set of guidelines that were created for the charitable food system called the HER, Healthy Eating Research Nutrition Guidelines for the Charitable Food System, which is a process of ranking food nutritionally to increase the supply and demand of healthy foods, because I think it was the 2014 study conducted by Feeding America called the Hunger and Health Study showed that, now I'm going to forget the exact numbers, but 1 in 3 households experiencing food insecurity have at least one family member with diabetes. It's like 50% have someone with high blood pressure or a heart-related illness. These diet-related illnesses and food insecurity are so closely entwined. So is food insecurity and your mental health. And these issues are just compounding. We often refer to it as like the double burden of food insecurity and health. So how can the food pantry both meet those needs, ensure people are accessing healthy food, ensuring they're accessing food that's going to support their long-term well-being, not just their immediate need for food, and also fit into that larger picture of meeting basic needs. If I know I can get food at the food pantry, that's going to save me $100 in groceries that can go towards my car payment so I can get to work next week, or go towards rent or whatever other expenses you have. So food tends to be that one item that's a lot easier to get help with. And how can we maximize that so that people can take care of themselves in other areas?
Okay, I have a harder question I did not warn you about, but it came up. Okay, so on one hand, we're talking about welcoming and creating the welcoming environment, client choice. This is all about, we talk in CHEP a lot about dignity, right? And the humanity, the dignity. And then you have nutrition education, which can feel a little patronizing. You might be, how do you balance how do you do nutrition education in a way that promotes dignity, that you're not saying your foods are bad, or do you get what I'm trying to
Yeah,
ask? How do you balance
I
that?
totally do.
Okay.
So I want to focus on two different pieces. And I want to pull up pictures again because I love
Okay.
it. So in the charitable food system, what we consider like the traditional model of distributing food is you get a pre-packed bag of items, and classically they're things like canned meat, canned soup, canned vegetables, pasta and sauce, very shelf stable foods. But it's also going to be a mix of whatever donations the food pantry gets. That's kind of the classic image of a food pantry a lot of people have. One of the better practices we promote is what we call offering choice. So setting up your food pantry like a grocery store where people can select the foods that are best for them. One of the benefits of structuring your store like this, your pantry like this, is that it opens the door to promoting healthy food and providing those nutrition education or nudges, because think of the difference between getting a random bag of food that you may or may not like. I personally did not grow up on canned foods. My mom did and didn't like it. So she did not raise us on canned foods. But it means that if I were given a bag that was full of like canned beans, canned collard greens, canned pork, I might not know what to do with that or how to turn that into a healthy meal. When you're providing people with the option of foods that they can select for themselves, instead of canned beans, I can get canned corn. Instead of canned mandarin oranges, I can get fresh oranges. Like, it's those types of choices that are more empowering for folks and creating that more dignified environment. But it's also an opportunity to gather feedback without even asking on what people actually want and what they want to see. Because if I have a beautiful display of bananas and oranges and they disappear really quickly, I can quickly infer that that's what people are looking for and that's what people want more of. There are other more structured ways of making sure you are gathering feedback from neighbors. And I use the term neighbors a lot. That's the Feeding America term to describe people who come to food pantries to get food. Again, kind of just destigmatizing that people who experience food insecurity are our neighbors. They are people in our community, and you don't know by looking at someone if they're in need of charitable food. So if I say neighbors, that's what I mean. And then also changing that system to make that food access, healthy food access, realistic. Because if the food banks are just getting donations of canned soup, canned goods, ramen noodles, those are foods that are not going to support our long-term health. And that's where the healthy eating research guidelines come in. I'm going to call them the HER guidelines from now on because it's easier. To change that system, those policies and systems, to change the supply of food so that we're really focusing on providing those healthy foods. It ranks foods based on 3 key nutrients into green, yellow, and red. Choose often, choose sometimes, and choose rarely. So it can be a challenge in how you propose the guidelines. The idea is to really focus on those green foods to increase access to those healthy foods. But to your point, Jen, it can be an opportunity to stigmatize people's food choices or not listen to people and what they want, I guess, which is not their intention at all. So it's balancing that with neighbor feedback and finding that slice of the pie where the two interests overlap. What are healthy foods that people are looking for that the food bank can provide, and how can we encourage selection of those foods as well? There's a lot of buzz in the Charitable Food Network about focusing on culturally preferred foods. So making sure that in different communities, we have the variety of foods that people are looking for. So especially for food banks that have really large service areas in one area, rice and beans might be much more popular, and in the rotation, as opposed to another area where people are really looking for spaghetti and meatballs, right? Like different groups want different foods, and being able to collect those neighbor preferences, find healthy versions of those foods, and then bring it back to the neighbors is the dream.
Great. Two things to help people kind of get a picture of this. One of the big shifts that like a food bank in one of our areas made was the person who was sourcing all of the canned fruit made a choice. And so when they're sourcing it, like think Costco, but bigger, think forklifts, they're maybe sourcing canned peaches. They made an effort to switch from canned peaches and syrup to canned peaches and like pear juice, which meant all of the hundreds of agencies sourcing their food from them had easier access to nutritious food. So it's a choice kind of in the middle area on where they were buying food and how they were doing it. It kind of trickles down. One of my favorite examples from some of our partners, and I know I'm seeing faces that work with food banks this summer and from other things, so I'll be interested in what y'all are doing. One of the agencies switched from calling it like a nutrition section, because it can be like, hey, this is healthy, and who wants to eat something because it's healthy, to talking about flavor, because we can relate flavor to flavor, and so like, hey, this has a lot of protein. Like, I mean, like, yeah, that's cool. But saying like, hey, this goes really well with this. They started keeping spices and marinades. Sometimes you do need the red oil, like vegetable oil is probably red, right? One of the rarely, or it's not. Well, there's some that are red, but you need them to cook the green. Like they go with the green, right? They're not bad foods. So I've seen some really creative stuff happening to kind of bridge that nutrition, but with dignity, not like we're not coming in to patronize. So yeah.
That's a really great point. And I like this graphic was made by our partners at the Yukon Red Center, again, tying in how research can support these programs and also make an impact. But this was looking at a stoplight nutrition or traffic light nutrition ranking system based on the HER nutrition guidelines. And that's one of the tactics we use is behavioral economics, or nudges. So how do we make the healthy choice the easy choice? Because I've taken a lot of nutrition classes. I'm not a registered dietitian, but I've worked with a lot of registered dietitians. I've read a ton of food books because that's my nerdy interest. And first of all, nutrition as a field and as a science is based heavily on white people's beliefs on what health and nutrition is and should be, and what the ideal of beauty is and should be. So there's a lot to unpack there. But it also, now I've completely derailed myself. So there's understanding nutrition, and then there's understanding our crazy, crazy food system, which is full of processed foods that intentionally trick people into believing they're healthy. If you go down the cereal aisle, I think it's Michael Pollan, who's like, if a food tries to convince you it's healthy, it's definitely not. But you'll walk down the cereal aisle and it's full of bright colors. It's full of like, can contribute to a healthy diet. This is heart healthy. This is whatever. It has a green heart on it and doesn't tell you what that means. It's all natural. So it's not an easy system to understand. And one of the intents and purposes of systems like the HER guidelines is to make that nutrition information really easy to understand so that people can make informed choices. It's not about making choices for people, stigmatizing their choices, but just to say, hey, these foods are really high in saturated fat, sodium, and added sugars. Those three key nutrients are linked to diet-related illnesses like hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, whereas these green foods are going to support your health. And just off the bat, I spent a lot of time talking about this, so I'm sorry if I get too technical, but like all fresh produce is ranked green, choose often. It doesn't matter if it's collard greens, it doesn't matter if it's kale, it doesn't matter if it's insert your favorite fruit or veggie, because we know those whole produce are better for you. And to your point, Jen, about adding flavor to food, that was a really intentional decision on the part of the creators of the guidelines, was that any cooking staples and condiments are intentionally unranked because they are so critical to cooking at home, which is inherently healthier than eating prepared foods or eating out. And that's where a lot of regional flavors are added. So whether you need certain cultural spices, condiments like soy sauce, high in sodium, so is ketchup. So making sure that no one culture is disparaged for their personal flavors, and recognizing that all cultures have healthy foods to promote and increase access to is one of the big goals of these guidelines. And there are a lot of creative ways to implement them, as Jen mentioned.
Great. I feel like I could make you talk about this for 2 hours. So I'm going to try and keep us and not just what I want to talk about. So I'm curious what you see as like some of the biggest hurdles for kind of your work in the next little bit, whether it's changing attitudes within the community so people come, or if it's changing, is it more on the community side so people access the services, or is it more working with partners on what they're offering? What are some of the big challenges coming up?
That's a great question. And I'll say I'm in a really privileged position for my own work specifically, that people who are interested in making these changes and interested in engaging and creating a more dignified environment tend to seek out our consulting services, and that's how we end up working together. I think the biggest challenges tend to be that our systems are not adapting to people's needs. And so we're seeing more and more people coming to food pantries, which overwhelms the system, and people tend to then revert to what they think is easier or think is going to serve the most people the most efficiently, which tends to be those pre-packed bags. It's really easy in direct service. As soon as you start getting overwhelmed, you put your customer service aside and you just try to serve as many people as you can, which reduces that dignity piece, that dignified environment. And again, it gets people into this scarcity mindset that we don't have enough for everyone. We don't have the ability to serve everyone the way we want to. And so we're just going to do the best we can. And that's a lot of our work, is shifting people out of that scarcity mindset and into a mindset of abundance, to say, we do have resources. If we don't have resources, we have great partnerships, and we can do this work together.
I'm guessing a lot of you interns might be working with families who I've experienced a lot in the community who will say, well, I don't want to take food from someone else. So there's the getting the partners ready, but it's also getting the community ready, that it's the partner's job to have enough food, so if we used to say human and hungry, like that's the requirement, and that it's our job to have enough food to meet that need. And so yeah, there's people who may have never had to use food assistance before, but may have been running into other things. I'm like, Patrick, you might run into them for another community event in Savannah, or you might have, I'm like, where do I have people? Someone over, like, I see Abby, like for health reasons, other costs coming up, kind of getting them to be okay accepting help, because dignity is, when you serve with dignity, you don't have to put pride on the back burner. You don't have to get rid of your pride to get help, which is huge. Okay, so second to last question, I promise, and then if y'all have questions, we can go. So you have, like many of these interns here did a liberal arts undergrad education with math and environmental studies, and you studied languages, and now you're there. How did you go from math and environmental studies to nonprofit consulting on food systems?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I have had a very windy path. My main interest in food systems as a whole has been from an environmental lens. That was kind of my intersection and access point to something that is a big issue. I think most of the people in this room know that environmental issues touch everything: environmental justice, air quality, health, the whole 9 yards, as does food. So I was really interested in that intersection, and I've been working in different pieces of the food system for quite a while. I always love telling the story. When I was a kid, I was like 11 years old and I had my own catering company. So I would spend my week developing a menu, and then I'd spend all Monday cooking a huge dinner, package it up in little Tupperwares, and my mom would drive me around and I'd deliver it to family and friends in town. That was my catering company. That was my first job too. So understanding like that really is a passion of mine, is just food in general and sharing food with people that I care about. And then I have different experiences. I've worked on a farm, I've worked in dining services, I've worked at restaurants. And then in college, I was like, no, I'm really going to focus on environmental issues. And I did a couple internships with Connecticut River Watershed Council, now the Connecticut River Conservancy. I did an internship with the Nature Conservancy, and really respect those organizations, but I was like, I really need something a little more tangible and a little more direct service-y. So I did 2 years with Food Corps, which is an AmeriCorps grantee where you work directly with kids in schools to increase access to healthy food. So we had a school garden. I worked with the cafeteria to do taste tests around the harvest of the month. And this was in Maine, so they tended to be cold weather hardy crops like brassicas and potatoes and apples. And I taught hands-on lessons in classrooms that were food-based. So things like how to read a recipe and adapt it to different size meals, or like practicing fractions and everything, or just basic cooking skills that kids could do, running after school cooking programs. And through all of this, the central themes were really social justice, so increasing healthy food access, and just the intersection of food and the environment. So when I wrapped up my time with Food Corps, I really wanted to continue those two themes, and increasing food access on a larger scale led me to working at a food bank, specifically in their research branch, which is not something every food bank has, but I really wanted to look at larger systems and thinking through larger scale solutions, because I do believe that food banks and food pantries are a really band-aid solution to this problem. So you have to both meet the immediate need and look downstream, upstream to longer term solutions. And that led me to where I am today, working with really cool people who do really awesome work and are taking that systems approach and applying it to their daily work.
So in summary, you took one step at a time. I think we have some interns who, when I talked to you, you knew exactly like the subspecialty of something you wanted to do. And that's cool. And then there are others of us who were like, I'm going to take it one step at a time. And that's also really cool. So some people maybe have it all charted out, and some this summer will help them be like, you know what, I thought I wanted to do. I have an intern from many years ago who's now in a PhD, went to Helena, Arkansas to do what he thought he wanted to do with economic revitalization. And they were doing that 4 days of the week. And he thought that's what he wanted to do. He hated it. But on the 5th day, he worked with the school systems and kind of did this other stuff and loved it. And now is in a PhD program for like changing school systems. And, it's as much getting in it and being like, actually, I don't actually like that. No, that's not for me, is as important sometimes as finding things you do love doing, at least in my mind. All right.
You got to try it out and see what sticks, because sometimes it's going to be the work environment that you really love. Sometimes it's the direct service or the systems approach or something else. And like, I loved working in schools. I love working with kids. I really didn't want to be a teacher. And that was really important for me to learn earlier in my career, because it helped me pivot into what seemed like a different field, working in food banks, even though it's very similar to what I was doing just in schools as a specific context.
All right. Are there any questions? I know you're going to have at least one.
I have a question. So you mentioned the choice model and then going into behavioral econ and nudging, and I was curious about kind of what are these other best practices that research is leaning towards, and then also like where are the sources for that research? Is it coming from food banks? Is it coming from pantries? Or is it coming from like super centers and like Kroger that's then being able to be leveraged over to like what are people looking at and how can you design a store?
Yeah, those are great questions. So I'm going to start with the better practices side. There are 3 that we promote. So offering healthy choice, which kind of wraps up offering choice with dignity, providing a variety of healthy foods, all great. Creating a welcoming culture. Jen talked about how stigmatizing it can be to seek charitable food. And Feeding America actually identifies one of the 4 main barriers to accessing charitable food to be your personal experience. If you go to a food pantry and you have a terrible experience because someone was rude to you, because you felt ashamed while you were waiting outside in line where all your neighbors could see you waiting for help, that can be really stigmatizing. So how do we change that culture and that environment to make people feel respected, dignified, and welcome? And that can lead to a lot of other things. And the other is connecting to community resources. And I'm going to dig into that one a little more because it gets to your other question about research. So when you talk about connecting to community resources, I view all of this work on continuums. It can be as simple as providing information about additional resources, but that tends to be less effective than a program that we support food pantries to use, which is called coaching with motivational interviewing. So you work one-on-one with a guest over a course of 6 to 9 months to work on their goals and build self-efficacy, and work on not just their immediate goals. So some people might say, like, I need to pay rent this month, but to support them in building up to other things like getting a job, which means attaining childcare and also making sure you have reliable transportation and providing warm referrals to resources that are going to support that person and achieving their larger goals. A lot of these programs have been studied by my boss and other researchers in different capacities. So there are a lot of research institutions out of universities that do this work. The UConn Red Center does a lot of really great work around obesity, nutrition education, and health outcomes in the charitable food system. That's the slide I held up that had the arrows of increasing green foods and decreasing red foods is what that meant. A lot of that has been done out of the UConn Red Center. So they've conducted studies at food pantries and with food banks to validate these practices and develop programs. Some are funded or conducted through Feeding America. They have their own research department and also contract out to other research facilities. So we're working on a project with them right now to measure the impacts and barriers and facilitators to offering choice at pantries. And they have a huge grant through the Morgan Stanley Foundation, and they've subcontracted to us at More Than Food Consulting and NORC at the University of Chicago, which is a research institution. And we handle the evaluation of the grant program that involves surveying neighbors, having the pantries fill out surveys, conducting interviews, and then packaging all of those findings in a way that's usable for food pantries and food banks to replicate. The coaching program I mentioned because it's really interesting. If you're interested in research, I can share some articles, but it was part of a completely randomized trial. And I'm not a researcher, so I should really stop myself before I get too in the weeds. But they did compare the outcomes measured food security, self-efficacy, financial security with a group that used this model food pantry that offered these better practices, which we call More Than Food, and coaching compared to like your traditional food pantry, and measured their outcomes over the course of 9 months and found significant impacts and improvements in their self-efficacy and ability to support themselves over that time period. So that's what I mean when I say like these are validated. There's research to support it. A lot of great groups are doing this work, and there are a lot of opportunities to do that.
We might follow up and ask a couple more questions about research, or see if you'll send us those articles. But I did try to put some of the links in for More Than Food, but we had a question. Are there any book recommendations for those people interested in learning more about structural prejudice in nutrition, perception of what is nutritious, or just your food in general? And I did lead off with the recommendation of your boss's book.
Fantastic.
Which is a great book. Like I give it
on the screen. This is really a foundation of a lot of the work that I do, is the ideas in this book that Katie, again, she's a PhD, has been researching this for a long time, has visited hundreds of food pantries. This is kind of the culmination of her work in the field. Culmination makes it sound like she's done, but this is a really great tool if you want to learn more about the history of the charitable food system, how we've gotten to where we are today, and what these newer models of food pantries and food banks can look like that support these long-term solutions. So I would highly recommend reading this. It's written for a food bank and food pantry audience, so it's really accessible. I've recommended it to my friends who are not engaged in food security work, and they're like, this is really interesting. You learn something new every day. In terms of nutrition and structural prejudice, I really love the book Fearing the Black Body, which is a really great look at weight stigma. So the idea is that we often take a moralistic stance about health and say, like, you know, if you're healthy, you're a good person, et cetera, et cetera. And the author traces the roots of fat phobia actually to structural racism, which is really fascinating because it just takes a lot of the wind out of the sails of that argument, and helps us understand that it is one of the many tools that have been used to oppress people of color in our country and in our society. So that's a really great one, Fearing the Black Body. It's written by a researcher who looks at the issue through a historical lens. So she doesn't get into the science of nutrition and health as much, if that's your interest. If you're curious, I have so many great book recommendations. I have to think about which ones are the most relevant. There are a lot more books, a lot more people joining the nutrition field from different backgrounds, i.e. not all young white women. As like the podcast Food Psych by Christy Harrison, she brings on a lot of different nutritionists who talk to their own experiences with weight stigma and kind of pushing back against a lot of the white perceptions of health and nutrition, but there are a lot of really great resources out there. I can send some more after the call because I can't think of a lot off the top of my head.
That's fair. We put you on the spot for recommendations and research recommendations. I think some of our students, after their internship, if they're doing like a minor or concentration, some go on to do a capstone project or a community-based research project. I know in Rockbridge County, where some of these folks are, including the people who just asked that question, a lot of them work with some of the local charitable food network agencies and kind of doing some different research on different components. And I can tell you for a fact that the director of that agency loves her boss's book, so I think thinking about ways to do research in a way that serves the community might be on the minds of people as they go back into class and research and capstone projects and that sort of thing. Are there any other questions?
There are a lot of ways, if you're interested in doing research, to think about how you can bring that neighbor voice into organizations. So maybe it's through focus groups, maybe it's through surveys, maybe it's a project around culturally preferred foods in your community. Like there's so many areas where food pantries and food banks don't have a lot of resources to conduct the research themselves, but could benefit from some boots on the ground support around these questions. Sorry, you're going to say something else.
I just want to be really respectful of time. Are there any other questions? I can also follow up with Maisie and ask her if she gets off the call and thinks of like 5 books, I will put it in with the recording. I also want to later this summer just have an optional Zoom. I know I'm looking at the names and I know some of y'all are working with food systems. I think like Amelia, are you at Feeding Chittendom? If I can do I have 70 of y'all and somehow I kind of know where most of y'all are, which is kind of scary. A lot of y'all are working, some are with food banks, some are with direct. I think I saw Luke on the call doing more like the direct partner agency. And then we have Brittany also here who's at the local food bank. So like they're in the same city, but on 2 different levels. I'd love to put like a Zoom together just for y'all to talk about what you're learning in different areas. Like maybe someone's doing recipe development and that sort of thing. Amelia, did I get it right? Is that where you are?
Yeah, I am.
Sorry, just got really excited. It's like a quiz. So are there any last questions before we let Maisie go? Oh, Patrick, you're gonna go for it.
I have one more follow-up about the reduced price model and if like what your thoughts are on that. And because I read an article about like incorporating dignity in spending and earning versus receiving, and like purchasing versus receiving in that. And I wondered what like your experience thinks about that model.
Yeah, so are you talking about having reduced prices in stores so that people can purchase their own foods as opposed to donating that into the charitable food system where you would receive it for free?
More so that like some food pantries would have like a non-fungible token, or they'd have reduced prices so low that like you would have to purchase things, but it'd be so like it would be affordable enough for that person to just buy it themselves.
Yeah, this is kind of where systems get in the way of each other sometimes, because I think there's a lot of benefit to having people pay into a program that they're benefiting from. It does increase ownership, it reduces that power dynamic, and can be really beneficial. I love examples of this working really well are things like the double up SNAP bucks. So people are getting benefits through the government. They're getting the opportunity to spend that money supporting their local communities and are getting even better benefit from it. From what I've heard at pantries is that it becomes a challenge because you can't charge for donated food. That is, I'm going to say illegal, but definitely not a practice that is allowed in our charitable food system, for a lot of understandable reasons. So there are a lot of barriers in that way. Pantries who do that sometimes can't get food from their food bank. They can't get different products. So thinking about how you can merge those systems is the bigger challenge. I think it's a great opportunity, and I don't see a lot of downsides except that our system is not set up for it. There are more models of grocery stores that are pay as you can. So I think Billings Forge in Hartford, Connecticut is trying to set up a model like that with support of the food bank. Don't know where their product is coming from. In that case, I think they have to purchase a lot of the product in order to sell it back to the community. So it's just a very different funding source, but at the same time, then you tend to get better product, which is a more dignified experience. So I'm for it.
The great question is something that I'm guessing will kind of come up more and more. Yeah, I think a lot of these programs still also do use like USDA and TFAP, like some of those programs, you can't sell that, so it's the different restrictions and optics are hard, but I think it's an interesting question going forward, like what is better for the community and for the individual versus what sounds better,
And
we are.
And there are tons of studies validating existing systems like SNAP. Granted, not everyone is eligible for SNAP, which is a huge barrier, even though you would benefit from that assistance. And SNAP regulations vary from state to state. But, when you talk about choice, like that's the ultimate form of choice, is having money that you can spend at the store on the foods that you want. So, yeah.
All right. So Maisie, any last piece of advice? They have about 5 weeks and 5 weeks and a day of their internship left. Any advice if you wish you had when you were interning in college, whether it's, update that LinkedIn profile and network, even though it's miserable and we all hate it, or at least I do. I love it. I hate it.
I've been thinking about this question, Jen, since you included in your email. I have 2 pieces of advice. One, I'm borrowing from a conference organizer, which you guys are in really awesome internships where you have the opportunity to meet people doing really different things. So this conferences are a very similar situation where you're inundated with ideas, you're learning a lot all the time, and you're meeting a bunch of really great people all the time. So their recommendation was to have a list of 5 people that you meet throughout the time that you want to follow up with, and have really specific reasons why you want to follow up. Say like someone at the organization you're interning at gave a really neat presentation. Say like, okay, they're one of my 5 people and I'm going to talk to them about this exact thing, because that opens up the door to a wider conversation. And it helps you narrow your focus about what you're interested in. Like, are you interested in the research that they're doing and you want to have a conversation about research? Are you curious the fact that they've been in this position for 20 years and you want to know what it takes to have that lifelong commitment to this cause? I think that's much more targeted networking than just saying like, hey, you have a cool position, tell me about your work, which can be really vague and not always a productive conversation. The other piece of advice I have is to sign up for newsletters. This is really weird, but I wish I had done it before I left college, because organizations put a lot of effort and time into putting out weekly, monthly newsletters that are chock full of resources, including job openings, highlights of cool people doing cool things, research articles, resources. And it's a great way to learn more about an organization you're interested in or a field you're interested in. Something I found, especially in the charitable food network, is that these circles are really tiny somehow. So I'll be talking to someone who works at a food bank in Chicago, and they'll know this other consultant that we work with in like California. People run in the same circles. And if you just keep tabs on those sources of information, it's a great way to learn more about the industry, the work, and kind of who the players are, that if you then ever meet them or reach out to network, you have a little more information to work with. And it's a great way to find out about jobs. I still hate job searching, and I prefer the passive means where people tell me about the cool jobs that are opening up.
I like that a lot. It's also a way to know, like, who knew that that job existed? Like, oh, I could be a research analyst for More Than Food Consult. It's like, I didn't even know that was a thing someone could pay me to do. Thanks for coming. I will get the recording up and get some of these kind of links. I'll make sure I have the correct links for the different book recommendations and podcasts, and I'll work with Maisie to make sure I have the right ones. But thanks for coming and good luck with your internship this week.